Welcome back to another episode of Packet Party. Here we are doing part 2 of our episode with Grant from Hamina. In this session, we cover more concepts around AI and how it relates to wireless performance. We also tackle some really interesting topics around RF engineering and wireless design concepts and a lot of other good stuff. So make sure you stay with us until the end of the episode. I hope you enjoy this one.
Yeah, and just one last thing, if you were using something like Hamina, the way I would be using AI would be like, look, I'm looking to design a network for X vendor. What are the recommended deployment, parameters that I should be using? What's the strongest signal? What's the secondary and the tertiary? You could go through that type of a process, and if it's a good AI prompter, it should give you references that you can then check to make sure that it is the latest version of that. Because as we talked about before with, say, ultra wideband deployments, I know that the AP density is significantly more than if you were just going to deploy like a voice grade network. So you can use AI to help, I guess, refine what your actual design is going to be in a tool like Hamina.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. Wow, there's just so much to think about and consider when doing all of this, which is just insane. I had one question for you as well. So, I mean, we've been talking about obviously designing a lot of wireless instances, but I believe you also have an integration with some vendors with Hamina where you pull in their existing floor plans, their existing AP placement, and in a sense, you can sort of grade or judge, in a sense, the existing placement and make suggestions on how to change and shift the locations as well. I'm remembering this correctly, aren't I?
Yes. Yeah. So we call that Hamina Live, and so it's recently just sort of come out of beta, but we've got it pretty much across the board. If the AP vendor is in the enterprise space and they have a cloud platform, we've got a version of that, and it's purely just done through API key and API calls from the Hamina console. And so, yeah, effectively, you could just have a blank project. You could enter the API credentials from the vendor into Hamina, and it will download the floor plan. It'll download the AP locations. It'll download the any switching infrastructure if it's the same vendor. And so from there, you can get high level of what does the RF telemetry look like. So show me the heat map. You can then which could be really handy for remote troubleshooting. The initial reaction for a lot of I think network engineers is when there is a problem, I need to send someone on site. I need to do a packet capture, or I need to do a site survey, or I need to use whatever analysis tool I'm going to use, or maybe they'll go into the vendor cloud dashboard and they'll start to go through some different screens and tabs and things like that. And so I guess, with Hamina, you can minimize having to go to site straight away. So you can get the RF telemetry right there and then, and it does simplify it as well. So a lot of the information that we provide in Hamina can be viewed or seen in the vendor dashboard, but it's across multiple tabs, multiple windows and submenus and things like that. And we just kind of basically give you all the RF specific information in one place. You can then drill down to the access point level to the client level as well. So if the client is just associated to the network, and we will just start polling the client and basically checking it's like, send, receive, what sort of RSSI we're getting from the client. We can force the client to reconnect. We get all sorts of metrics as well at the client level too. So, so it could be a particular area of the environment that is reported to be a problem, and you could see, high level, what is the AP uptime? Maybe you just did a big firmware update, and you notice that the uptime on the AP is 48 days, and everyone else is like half a day. You go, okay, this guy didn't reboot properly, right? So you could try and force a reboot, from Hamina, or you may need to go into the the vendor CLI and do something like that, or whatever. And then you can then drill down to the client level. And so if it is a specific client, you could search for the client types as well. Like maybe it's just a bunch of iPads. Oh, okay, they're on iOS version something. We know that it's a client related issue, and so maybe we can raise that with TAC. Is there a some sort of a firmware bug with this version of iOS and this? So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. Once that's all downloaded, though, you then Hamina copies all of that into the simulation sandbox. So from there, you could actually, in the simulation side, you could, in theory, look at like, what does my upgrade look like? So we talked before about, having, the access point placements are probably going to be different, and also like, what does the wired and the switching side of it look like? So Hamina does all of that, and you could simulate what an upgrade looks like. You might even want to show your current manager. We've got a thing that we call client experience. You could say, hey, this is what my current iPhone looks like, and you can walk him through the environment and show your management, and then say, and now I'm going to show you what the upgrade would look like and how much better the network would perform, if we were to go with, with these new Wi-Fi 7 access points. And so, there's a couple of different scenarios there that I know to break it down, but there's a few ways you could go with the tool. It's very powerful and pretty flexible.
That's the same one you've showed before, where you can simulate a person walking around the floor,
Yes.
holding a phone, and can actually see the actual throughput. Well, it does not directly translate to the user experience, but you can get a faint idea of, okay, this area might need better coverage because the throughput has gone down, really, really bad, and such things. I don't know, but I haven't seen something like that in other tools. So I was really blown away by how you guys were able to put that data in there and that capability in there.
Yeah.
Legit to me as well. I know that so many end users don't really want to have to contact IT if they can avoid it, right? So I'm sure so many customers out there have dead spots that they're even not aware about, or problems that are occurring that they just don't see, because no one's going to sit there and grep, logs for wireless access points all day to try to identify potential issues, right? So I love this idea of simulation and pulling in the live environment and all of these overlays. That's just mind blowing, absolutely mind blowing. How more people are not using this already is just beyond me, because every wireless upgrade needs this.
Yeah. And I mean, and I guess the nice thing with it being a SaaS product is you just, you subscribe for a period of time. You could go through your upgrade cycle, and then just let it, unsubscribe, let it lapse, whatever you want to do, and then pick it up in a couple of years, when you've got the Wi-Fi 9 or Wi-Fi 10 upgrade cycle ready to go. And maybe at that point, Hamina is just a one-click button. It just does, AI does the entire thing. But
that'd be the day.
But you've got that flexibility, I guess. In what you want to do there.
Yeah, and a little peek under the hood of what Hamina does. I know you've described this to us a few times before. You guys work hard to get in touch, in constant communication with vendors such as our employers, that even before an AP hits the market, you guys are already working in the background to get information like, what are the specs on these access points, what are the radiation patterns. Fun fact, you guys might not know this, the listeners might not know this, but different access points are designed slightly differently. The way I like to think about this is, think of a torch. You have torches that actually are omnidirectional, where that's the sort of lamp you put in a camp spot, and it illuminates a certain area, as opposed to certain APs behave like a torch that have directed light beams. So these are the radiation patterns, so to speak, and this is something that you guys work hard to integrate into Hamina, and actually slightly not really impacts, but really affects how the quality of that site survey information comes out. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Um, yeah, so it also just sort of made me think with like I guess yeah, with the omnidirectionalness, and we might have a myriad of different users, that are or potential users that are listening. You can even use like the free version of Hamina if you wanted to do like your own, you know, home design or home network design. So it does have, some different things in there. But to your point, Fred. So, there was a pretty large vendor event for us in November of last year. I'm sure if you look up Australia vendor events, you'll be able to find who it is.
Hmm. Yep.
You guys are employed by this company, and we were under NDA, but we heard that there was going to be a new AP released at the event. And so, we spoke to our developers and they said, oh, yes, we've got it in our test cloud. We will do a production push overnight to have it available like day and date of the announcement. And of course we got people coming up to the Hamina booth saying like, oh, I bet you don't have the new vendor XYZ AP, and we're like, actually here it is, and it's in production right now. So if you are using the tool, or even if you're using the free version and you want to put one of these great new APs in your home environment, you can design it using that. So the nice thing about it being cloud based is we do update it every week. So weekly we do update it, and so sometimes the updates is nothing user facing. It's back end optimizations and things like that. But a lot of the time it is like, hey, here's a stack of new access points and radios. To your point, Fred, like a directional radio that's that's going to help shape coverage. We will put that into the tool. And then other times there's, like some sort of a big feature release. Like the big one recently was the full building design. So that's in production now. So, people that are designing for, I don't know, multi-story hospitals and hotels and, enterprise spaces, throw your floor plans into Hamina and it'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
Oh yeah, the 3D design, that was really awesome. I know it's been there since the beginning, but surveying in 3D, mate, that's mind blowing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, with my background, I've looked at like millions of floor plans. At least it feels like millions, right? And so when you look at a floor plan, you can sort of start to understand, like, at least in my head, what the environment layout is probably going to look like. But for a customer, for the maybe the network owner, they probably don't visualize that. They don't look at floor plans all the time, and so the ability to design the environment in 2D to make it nice and easy, and then you just switch the 3D mode on and you can show the customer. And like you said, you've got the ability to move your client simulation through the environment and show them what the network is going to look like and the expectations of how it will perform. That it kind of creates that connection for the customer to the environment. And I think it helps better, sell what they're actually getting versus them just looking at a 2D floor plan, with a bunch of dots on a map, and, it all looks green and things like that.
It theoretically looks green, but in actual reality, it ends up being red.
Yes.
That very much actually reminds me of a retail customer I once had where they had planned in the 2D, forgetting the 3D, and that they have, massive metal shelves, right? And metal is not exactly great for RF. And so they were having all of these dead spots within the retail store because of poor AP placement in the end, because they didn't think in 3D. And so that sort of mindset is really shifting. And that really like segues us really nicely into the next topic of really what are some of the more like common mistakes you see people make when designing wireless networks? And I guess how has Hamina, helped offset some of that for some people?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the home users. So please stop using wide channels. It creates so many problems.
I think I'm guilty of
Particularly,
that.
yeah. So the only reason I would use wide channels is if I was in a, like more of a rural type of setting where I don't have, too many neighbors close by. I've got all sorts of Wi-Fi tools so I can check what channels are and aren't in use, so I can use wide channels. But if you're in like a dense urban setting, say you're in like an apartment or something like that, I would highly recommend to not be using wide channels. And because the density, of the number of radios and the density of the clients has increased over time, that recommendation really extends into the enterprise space as well. So, in Hamina, you do have the ability to set. Hamina will suggest what channels you can use on your access points, and you can set it to automatically use a wide channel until it gets, channel interference, another access point on the same channel, and then it will automatically cycle down maybe from an 80 megahertz wide to a 40 to a 20 megahertz wide channel. And so, wider channels is, I guess for some of the listeners is basically just, it's an extra lane for the access point to client traffic, really.
Yeah.
But if you've got an access point, if you've got two access points that are overlapping on any channels, your throughput basically is chopped in half. So if you are seeing that you've got some channel interference, you probably want to reduce the channel width if you can. It's only going to cause more issues. So that's probably the one of the number one things that I see a lot of is, and usually it's the basic things. Minimum basic data rates as well. So I still see a lot of 1 and 2 meg data rates enabled. And honestly, if you've got a client that can only communicate at those very, very low data rates, it's probably time to retire it, throw it in the bin and get something newer. Because, when was 802.11b was like, 2000 or 1999 or something like that. It's so old, like, it's a classic. Go and put it in a museum, but don't turn it on or have it connected to the network.
So, Grant, would you say it's safe to think of this in when you mentioned, the wide channels and the data rates? I typically tend to think in terms of lanes on a highway, and the channel width is typically the lane, how wide the lane is. As opposed to, say, a lane that can fit a sedan, as opposed to a lane that can fit a huge trailer truck. And then the data rates would be the speed limit or the minimum speed limit allowed on that lane. So you're saying try to minimize and make sure that your lanes are only sufficient to fit one sedan and not try not to fit a huge delivery trailer truck in there, and make sure that the minimum speed limit is a certain speed. Is that right?
Yeah. So think of the wider lane as the leftmost lane is great. It's a dedicated lane to the access point. But if you want to do the wider lane, more often than not, it's also got traffic coming the other way. And so, you've got traffic in one lane, both trying to, and so you could imagine how slow that would be, like a stop start of the traffic trying to go, north and south and trying to navigate that, as opposed to having a smaller lane, but it's just dedicated to the access point. So, of course, there is many, different wireless tools out there, and even free, scanning tools you can get on smartphones as well, that you could scan your environment. You could see if there's any, channel overlap and things like that. But, generally, out of the box, a lot of, and even enterprise devices, they do tend to opt for a very, very wide channel. And I think because, marketing gets a little bit involved and, people are sold these very, very high data rates. And so that's what the expectation is. So, the CEO comes into his brand new Wi-Fi network, does a throughput test and then realizes, like, hang on, I'm only getting 89 meg per second. What? Hang on, we just paid like millions of dollars for this. What's going on? I was promised I was going to get 4+ gigabit per second, and that's just not the reality. And no one's going to necessarily need that kind of throughput on a on a smartphone or anything like that, at least now. But
I've had a customer who exactly mentioned that one, because he was testing out a dedicated Wi-Fi 6E AP, and the advertisement was gigabit speeds, and he came back complaining and saying, "Why am I only getting 800 or 900, not the full gig so they conveniently forget that there are overheads and other stuff that affects that throughput.
Don't forget bits versus bytes as well, right? That
Oh,
worries
yes.
everyone.
Yep. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
good.
So that,
Okay,
yeah.
I think I need to take a look at my home network settings again afterwards. Now that I've heard all of this, I'm probably guilty of some of this, but
Yep.
so I mean that covers, I guess, very nicely the home user environment, and then a little bit of the office as well, right? Where you're saying really we should be packing more for density with access points versus just trying to smash a single access point as hard as possible. To me, that sounds it makes sense. There's a lot around as well, not pushing an access point at 100%, right? It's not often very recommended, if I understand, because it doesn't then give you, I guess, much flexibility in making adjustments later on down the track. Do you still see a lot of people trying to plan for APs, punching out radios at 100%?
Uh, I don't think anyone plans to do it, but just so what happens is normally over time, just more devices are onboarded to the network, whether it's through BYD or some sort of a corporate requirement, and then suddenly the access point that was at 30% capacity a couple of years ago is suddenly at 80% capacity. And the running theory is that like once an access point's at like 70% capacity, with all the other RF overhead of it having to sort of beacon out and broadcast its name and all of that, it basically stops to really function effectively. So yeah, that's definitely something to sort of keep in mind. Maybe the other thing just to sort of touch on would be having the different SSID names for the different bands. So you should just have like a 2.4 SSID. I would probably call that something like slow, like have slow in the name or something, or that's just your guest Wi-Fi is just on 2.4 because you're not too worried about it, and maybe all your IoT goes on there, right? Put them on different VLANs, blah blah blah. For 5 GHz, that's probably like normal corporate, whatever. But then you have like the corporate like super fast, and that's the 6 GHz. And so then there's very clear separation because if you have your 5 and 6 GHz both named the same, the client ultimately makes the roaming choice, the decision of what radio it wishes to connect to. And a lot of the time, devices are not optimized for 6 GHz yet. There's still a bit of a feeling out process, and that client might just say, hey, you know what, that 5 GHz radio actually looks really good. But the 6 GHz radio is, again, we talked about like they generally cover the same area. It's probably similar signal strength, but it's just more familiar with 5 GHz, and so that's what it prefers to. So if you name the SSID and you tell the client, hey, I want you to connect to the ultra fast 6 GHz SSID, it will only connect to that, and then you'll get the best experience. So that can translate into the enterprise space, but also for your home environment as well. If you're looking to do something like that, definitely try to separate them out if you can.
I know a bunch of kids now that are running to kick all of their parents onto the 2.4 gigahertz band while they reserve six for
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah.
And to make things
Fantastic.
more confusing on the Wi-Fi 7 world, because I think Wi-Fi 7, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, Grant, I got this idea that Wi-Fi 7 is now starting to optimize, or at least part of the standard is to optimize whether or not a certain device should stay in 2.4 or jump up to 5 and 6. I mean, there's still that factor of letting the technology decide where to go, but it's unavoidable that most environments would have a good mix of laptops that can run on 5 or 6, and then you have IoTs, printers, some cameras, even some of the more popular consumer brand cameras are still running on 2.4. So, I think Wi-Fi 7 has, I hate to say this, but has kind of idiot proof that whole process. Would you say that's the case?
It maybe I wouldn't go as far as that, but I would say that it's definitely making it easier for adoption, and I think it will continue to make it easier. the thing to remember is that it is ultimately the client that chooses what network it will connect to, unless, like I said, with the naming of the SSIDs, you force it to, hey, you can only connect to my, my 2.4 security SSID, right? That's what I would do. But I know what you mean with each new generation that comes out. There's always a bunch of changes to the actual connection methodology of the clients. It still comes back to the client that makes the decision as well. And so, sometimes it's going to be up to the device. We've found, with certain Apple devices, like they still will prefer 5 gigahertz in certain scenarios, and then in others they will also prefer 6 gigahertz. And so, it's probably not enough time to get into it now, but there is, like, if you have a look on YouTube, there's a bunch of different talks about like enterprise devices and how they roam and how they make a choice on what channel that they wish to associate to. So even with all the smarts that we've got, like in the the different Wi-Fi generations, definitely getting better. It does ultimately come down to the client as well. So if you can kind of help nudge the client to
Yep.
it in a certain direction and entice it and say, hey, this looks really nice, you should connect here, that is definitely going to be your best bet.
It's like trying to get your child to do something, right? Or you have to give it an incentive. It's all about
Yep.
incentives.
Yes. Yep.
I love it. Usually, this is about the time in the podcast where we roll around to closing remarks. And I kind of feel like you've really just done a great job right there at the end, sort of summarizing really all of the cares and the things that we really need to think about of why you should design wireless properly. It's all about that experience, right? But Grant, is there any other final things that you really wanted to get off your chest before we close up our 2 episodes today?
Look, I think we covered just about everything we wanted to really do. I know we were sort of talking about, like, what tools might be available to help, to help simplify the experience for people. Look, I'm on the Apple ecosystem, but I know that if you're on Android, there is a bunch of different Wi-Fi scanning tools that are, mostly free and just ad supported that you could use to, to check out your environment, which is really, really great. Of course, there is the Hamina tools. If someone wanted to just do a basic design of their home environment, they could sign up to Hamina for free and do that as well. Otherwise, yeah, if you look for, other tools like Wi-Fi Explorer is a really great tool that's on Mac that can be used just to, to do Wi-Fi scanning and things like that as well. And then, yeah, if you've got, depending on the brand of infrastructure you've got, usually there's like, different scanning capabilities and packet capture capabilities in there as well. So, yeah.
I remember using Insider ages ago when it was still free, and now I realize it's already paid, which is good. That's good. It's improved because there's a bunch of good stuff you can do with it. But
Yep.
folks, you heard it here first. You can sign up for Hamina, sign up for trialing Hamina for free, and I can tell you definitely right now, it's really good. It's got pretty pictures of visualizing your Wi-Fi environment. It's just, I really love that. So I
Fantastic.
think just to kind of round that off, Grant, I know the whole episode pretty much explains why we should care about doing wireless the right way. But in a few words, why should people who are making the decisions care about doing Wi-Fi design the right way? Is it because wireless you're providing wireless as a service and you should care about giving the users a good experience, whatever it is? What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ultimately about giving the best user experience that you possibly can. And so, with most networks, it does start at the design phase. So even if it's a pre-existing site, you're probably going to want to redesign at some point. And so just understanding, okay, if I put an access point, over here and I put one over there and I put one here, that's going to, give me the right coverage and give the clients the best possible experience. That's ultimately, I think, what, why you should care about it and why you want to sort of do it in the first place. Like we said at the top, it's pretty rare that you get a device coming into the market nowadays that has got Ethernet. So most people's expectation is that they are going to, walk into that corporate environment and they're just going to be able to connect their laptop, their phone, their iPad to the infrastructure without any real issues. And so, optimizing the best placement for the access points. And of course, Fred, you talked before about different types of antennas. If you maybe some sort of a slightly trickier environment, open plan offices and warehouses and things like that are starting to adopt more and more of that. That's kind of why you really want to care about it.
Awesome. All right, mate, I have really enjoyed this episode, and it's worth every minute recording this with you. Vlad, any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to Grant?
No closing thoughts, just a huge thank you for giving us your time today. And I really hope our listeners appreciate all of the knowledge that we've been able to gain from you today. So thank you again, Grant.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
Vlad.
mate. I
Thanks,
hope
Fred.
to, I hope to, for if we come up with more interesting topics around wireless, definitely reaching out to you. We look forward to having you again on the show next time.
Excellent. No, appreciate it. Thanks, Vlad. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you very much. And okay, Vlad, I'll let you do our usual messages.
Our usual
The
messages.
Yeah, our usual messages. Like hit where can they get our episodes and what to look out for?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, what is it? Hit like, hit subscribe, leave us a comment on Spotify or YouTube. Get on all of the socials. We're on LinkedIn. I promise we'll respond to your comment if you post one to us. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
See you next time.